Hello and welcome to Power Pods. I'm Matt Alsop, Digital Marketing Manager for Hubbell Utility Solutions Power Systems Division, and also co-director of Saving Skylab, America's First Space Station documentary. You can view the documentary at savingskylab.com as well as YouTube. On this episode, we'll be talking to David Hitt, co-author of Homesteading Space, the Skylab Story, written with astronauts Owen Garriott and Joe Kerwin. Hitt has worked at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center since 2002 and currently serves as a payload engagement strategist for NASA's Space Launch System, working with scientists and mission developers interested in launching spacecraft on America's next generation heavy lift rocket that will return astronauts to the moon. A contractor employee with ASRC Federal, Hitt is a recipient of the Silver Snoopy Award given by NASA's Astronaut Office. A former newspaper editor, Hitt is a native of Huntsville, Alabama, and holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Mississippi. He is a former chair of the National Space Society's Policy Formulation Subcommittee and serves as a volunteer at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center Museum in Huntsville, a role he began during a restoration effort for the center's Skylab trainer. He and his wife, Rebecca, have one son, Owen. All right, David, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
First off, I want to say congratulations. You have a new baby boy. How's life been going with that?
So I tell you what, if I were going to have to telework for a while, I am so blessed that this is when I'm getting to do it. Being at home on my computer, begin to see that baby boy smiling at me every once in a while just makes everything a little bit brighter. It's a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, thank you so much for helping us with this project. Obviously, it probably wouldn't have gotten off the ground if it wasn't for your book, and capturing that story, the A.B. Chance story, and the involvement of Chuck, Lewis, and all of that. So we really appreciate your help with this.
Well, and I really appreciate y'all undertaking this project. This is the story of Skylab is such an important story. And so seeing it get new life in this way is exciting. And for me, oh, wow. I mean, this is just such a neat little indulgence to see what's maybe, a page in the book, but one of my favorite stories to tell people, seeing that one page brought out into a documentary like this is just, I would say wish fulfillment, except it's not something I knew I could wish.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. Talk a little bit about the book. How did it come about, and what kind of started you down the path of thinking this could be a book?
So way back in 2003, I was working as a NASA contractor at Marshall Space Flight Center supporting NASA education, and the website that I worked on at the time wrote articles for teachers and students about NASA projects. And we would have to come up with our own topics, have to find our own ideas. And so I've been doing this job for, about maybe a little over half a year, and was looking for a project to write about in May of 2003 timeframe, and doing some research, stumbled across the fact that it was the 30th anniversary of Skylab. Well, gosh, back in those days, I mean, some of my coworkers had heard of Skylab. They kind of, the older ones remember that was a thing that happened. The younger ones had maybe heard the name once or twice. But I said, why don't we do this? Why don't we do a story about Skylab? And in researching the story, I discovered that one of the Skylab astronauts lived there in Huntsville. And so, well, man, I wonder if he would talk to me. So I gave Owen Garriott a call and said, would you be willing to talk to me? I'm thinking maybe I'm going to get 5 minutes, maybe get a quote from this astronaut. Owen says, sure, why don't you come on over? So I go over to an astronaut's house. I mean, this is a first for me, I can assure you. This is a good day at work. Yeah. And we sit around, we chat about Skylab for a while. Well, I go back and doing some more research. For a second, I think, wait, we've got two Skylab astronauts in Huntsville. I had a list of where some of the astronauts were now, and there's Jerry Carr, Huntsville, Madison County. Well, it turns out Huntsville, Madison County is Arkansas, not Alabama. But before I realized that, I'd given him a call, and he's not in town, but he says, well, I'll be glad to talk to you. So I talked on the phone with Jerry Carr for a while, the commander of the third crew. we chat about Skylab for a while. I've got somebody now from the first crew and the second crew and the third crew. Clearly I need somebody from the first crew. So I just kind of cold called Joe Kerwin and, hey, you got a minute to talk about Skylab? Well, sure. All of these guys were very, very happy to talk about Skylab. I mean, everybody just kind of went out of their way to share stories. Started putting the story together, realized that, this is not one article. I mean, this turned into a 3-part series. It was the only multi-part series that we ever did for the website. But that meant that I had to do even more research to kind of round out the rest of the story around the interviews. And in doing so, realized there's just not a lot out there. I mean, it struck me as kind of sad that, there wasn't more literature out there about the Skylab program, and kind of had the thought, somebody ought to do something about that.
Yeah.
Was very content for that to be somebody else. Filed that thought away. Went on with my life. A few months later in Huntsville, we had a 30th anniversary celebration of Skylab. All of the astronauts came to town, the 8 that were still around then. Big event. They talked to the International Space Station, had panels, a gala symposium at the Space and Rocket Center, and that thought popped into my head again. Man, this would make a great book. Somebody should do this. And filed it away, went on with my life. So the next February, I was in Houston, Texas for an education conference. Went to the Space Museum there. They have an incredible Skylab exhibit. I mean, I'll say now, we've now got one at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville. There's one that was the second flight article at the Smithsonian, but Space Center Houston has done an incredible job with theirs. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking at that exhibit, and that little thought that had been filed away, it kind of comes back again. Somebody should do something about this. Mm-hmm. And I think my problem was, well, that's the sort of thing that, writing a book like that, that's the sort of thing that professional writers do. I mean, that's not somebody like me. That's a professional writer. And I'm standing in that room, and it occurs to me that every dime that I make is from writing. I mean, that's kind of the definition of professional writer. Yeah, right. So I said, okay, well, I'm gonna give it the old college try. So I come back home. I send an email to Owen Garriott asking if he'd be interested in, at that point, not even a book about Skylab, his memoirs. Owen flew on Skylab. He flew on Space Shuttle. So I'm thinking a book that captures his personal spaceflight story. I get back home. I send him an email. Hey, Owen Garriott, don't know if you remember me. We talked last year. Let me buy you lunch and talk to you about this idea, because what's going on in my head is there's no way that this astronaut is going to want to write a book with me. But if I offer to buy him lunch, I get to have lunch with a guy that lived in space for 2 months. That evening, I get to go home and call my dad and tell him the story about how I had lunch with an astronaut, and he told me he didn't want to write a book with me, and that's going to be a great day. Yeah. I mean, like that's going down as a W in the win-loss column. And so Owen and I had lunch, and had a great conversation. And he says, I've been thinking about that I need to write a book. Let's do it. Oh, well, I hadn't gotten that far. Yeah. like no mental scenario had gotten to, okay, let's write a book. So I went home that night and instead of calling my dad and saying, guess who I had lunch with, I went home and did some research about how do you go about writing a book with an astronaut and getting it published? Yeah. I called a friend who worked for a publisher up in New York. Hey, I need some advice here. While I was doing that, Owen was talking to Colin Burgess, who's the editor of the University of Nebraska Press's Outward Odyssey series. The most comprehensive popular spaceflight history series around. And Colin mentions, we're working on this series. We need to have a book about Skylab. We just had an author drop out. Would you like to have your book be part of the series? You don't need to find an agent. The contract will be in the mail. And so Owen and I decided, well, that sounds kind of easy. Let's let's do it that way.
Wow.
And so we start doing interviews, start talking to other folks. We contact Joe Kerwin just to interview him originally. And Joe says, well, I've been thinking about I should write a book. And so we decided to form a super team up and all work together. And Homesteading Space was the result. So it was kind of a lot of serendipity. People ask me, what's your advice for writing a book and what's your advice for getting a book published? And I'm like, the only advice that I have is be incredibly lucky. Because that's been my secret to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And like I said, even the working with University of Nebraska Press was just kind of serendipity. It wasn't something that we pursued. It fell in our lap. But it has been such a wonderful thing because any other publisher would have wanted greater control over what the final product looked like. They were so indulgent. Our goal for the book was we want 50 years from now for this story to exist. When somebody is doing some research, on the 100th anniversary of Skylab, we wanted this story to be recorded where people could go back and look at it. And another publisher might have, encouraged us to shrink it down a little bit. They let us do it our way. And we're so proud that all of that is now in the record.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the way we started with this documentary as well, is that, it needed more documentation before it slipped out of our hands, right? It's part of our history. So let's talk a little bit more about the astronauts, in particular, the first crewed mission. In the documentary, we kind of make it a point to focus on that second mission. Obviously, developing the tools and going through the processes was important. Talk a little bit about the astronaut. What were they like and what did they want to get out of this mission?
So, I'll start with the one that I didn't get to work with. I mean, of the 9 Skylab astronauts, 8 of them helped us with this book. I mean, again, went over and above, contributing, making this happen. The only one who wasn't able to was Pete Conrad, who had passed away 5 years before we started working on Homesteading Space. Pete's shadow loomed so large over the book, though. I mean, there's kind of an irony that that's probably the only way this book happened. Pete was so passionate about this story. And, Pete Conrad is one of 2 moonwalkers who have flown on Skylab. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean both flew on Apollo 12. On the way back from the moon, they were kind of chatting, what do you want to do next? And kind of said, well, there's this Apollo applications thing, this Skylab thing that's going on. Why don't we go do that? So while other astronauts were still fighting for seats going to the moon, they got first on the list for Skylab, became the commander of the first and second missions. He was he tried out for the Mercury 7. He was one of the second group of astronauts selected as part of the second class. He had tried out for the first 7, got turned down. He got rejected because he passed all the tests, did everything. I mean, he met all of the requirements. But at the end of it, the psychologist said he is not fit for long duration spaceflight.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, how about that?
Yeah.
So he tries again, and I don't know, maybe he behaved a little bit better the second time around or something. but he gets selected round 2, and I mean, he was an astronaut's astronaut. He gets selected for to command, to not just be part of, but to command the second manned moon landing. He's the 3rd person to walk on the moon. So once he gets in, he does a decent job. History kind of sides with Pete Conrad over the psychologist for the Mercury selection. But he does, he walks on the moon, crosses that off his bucket list. What's next? And, there in the back of his head, not fit for long duration space flight.
Yeah, right.
Well, he's got something to prove.
Yeah.
And, the way he goes into Skylab, I think, certainly makes the case that he had the right stuff for that mission.
Yeah.
Pete Conrad, before his death, was the future ahead of its time. Pete Conrad was already working on commercial space flight. He was working on how do we get private companies involved in space exploration. I mean, everything that you're seeing now with the modern era of commercial space flight, Pete Conrad was already laying the seeds for that back in the 90s. He was part of Delta Clipper. He was a consultant for Delta Clipper, the DCX. And this is another one of those that for a lot of people is just kind of a footnote. Maybe they've heard of it. But Delta Clipper, the DCX, was a project in the mid-90s. What does it look like to take a rocket, launch it vertically, and have it land vertically?
Wow.
Well, at the time, that's okay. Well, that's kind of weird. That's kind of different. That's kind of innovative. Today, well, yeah, duh, man. Of course, if you watch any SpaceX Dragon commercial cargo launch to the International Space Station, you're watching a Falcon 9. It takes off vertically from Kennedy Space Center, and it deploys the Dragon cargo vehicle, and then you see the Falcon 9 coming back, landing either on a drone ship out of the ocean or coming back to Cape Canaveral and landing when they launched the Falcon Heavy. Oh man, those two side boosters from the Falcon Heavy coming back to the launch site, coming back to Canaveral and landing in parallel. I mean, it's amazing. That's good stuff. And and here's Pete Conrad, literally 20, 25 years ago, making that happen. Yeah. No, they're not doing orbital flights yet. This is still the early days, but he's got his rocket launching and he's got it coming back to the launch pad and landing vertically, well over a decade before SpaceX started doing their grasshopper flights. So he saw the direction. Paul Weitz, I didn't get to work with as closely as I did some of the others. Joe Kerwin, people ask, they assume that because I was the writer on the book and working with two astronauts, that meant that I did the hard work and they just told me things. But the reality is, man, Owen and Joe, their footprints, their fingerprints are all over this book. I mean, they did so much heavy lifting. Joe, for his chapter about the first cruise mission, he wrote that. I came in, edited a little bit, but that's Joe Kerwin. Ed Gibson, I've got to give a shout out to Ed Gibson of the third crew. Not a credited author, but he saw a draft of the book. He said, let me help you with that. And made huge contributions himself. We had somebody from the first crew and somebody from the second crew, and so those chapters were great. The third crew is kind of what we could piece together about their adventure up there, and Ed decided that his crew needed the same treatment as the first and second, so he pulled off his gloves and got hands on and got dirty working with us and made huge contributions there. But so, Joe then was the corridor to PJ. I have very little direct interaction with him, working more through Joe Kerwin. The only one to fly again. Paul Weitz was the only one to fly again. He went again and he went up and flew Space Shuttle after Skylab. He was the only of that first crew. Some of the others on the second crew also flew shuttle, but PJ was the only one of the first crew to fly shuttle. Joe Kerwin. Joe goes into Skylab a doctor. I mean, he is a medical doctor. Even, a few years ago, he was still, when there was need to volunteer, bringing his medical background to bear, helping people. But he comes out of Skylab, and on Skylab, they tested this backpack, this jetpack. The idea was that this was something that they were going to use for space shuttle. It ultimately ended up getting implemented. At the time in the 80s, they called it the Buck Rogers backpack. An astronaut could put on this backpack and go out and fly away from the space shuttle completely independently. Just astronaut backpack spacesuit. Before they did it away from the space shuttle, they wanted to test it. Skylab was big enough. Skylab was big enough that you could fly this backpack around inside the space station. It's mind-bogglingly huge. But so that's one of the things that they did in that program, was they tested out this jetpack inside the space station. Years later, there's thought, okay, now we're doing this space station. Now we're going to do the, Space Station Freedom, International Space Station. We don't want to do the big jetpack anymore, but what if the astronauts had a small version of it, that if you were on the space station, you're going out, you're doing a spacewalk, you get cut loose from the space station through some, this is one of those things that should never happen, has never happened, but this is NASA. Let's have redundancy. Let's have precautions. Let's have contingency plans. If this thing that could never happen, should never happen, happened, how does an astronaut get back to the space station? Because the space shuttle can move around. It can maneuver. It can go pick you up if you got loose somehow. Space station can't do that. So let's create a small version of that backpack that in case of unimaginable emergency where you have an astronaut floating free from the space station, they can fly themselves back. And so what came out of that was a device called SAFER, the Simplified Aid for EVA Rescue. One of the patent holders for this device, Dr. Joe Kerwin.
Wow.
Comes into the astronaut corps, a medical doctor, a trained Navy aviator, comes out of it, enough of an engineer, enough of a rocket scientist to have a patent for for an astronaut equipment to fly you around in space.
Yeah.
So, like I said, just an amazing Renaissance man.
Can you tell me a little bit about the confusion with the numbering of the missions?
Skylab 1 was going to be the launch of the uncrewed launch of the Skylab space station. When they launched the space station itself, the workshop itself on a Saturn V, that's Skylab 1. Skylab 2 then is the first launch of crew. Joe Kerwin, Pete Conrad, PJ Whites to go live on Skylab. Skylab 3 is the second crew,
right.
Alan Bean, Owen Garriott, Jack Lousma. And Skylab 4 is the third crew, Jerry Carr, Bill Pogue, and Ed Gibson. The problem was the crews made patches.
Yeah.
And the crews made patches. When they made the patch, well, what do we put on the patch? Well, this is the first crew, this is the second crew, this is the third crew. Skylab 1, Skylab 2, Skylab 3. In the meantime, somebody not knowing about these patches decides Skylab 1, 2, 3, 4. So by the time the patches come back, you've got official documents that say 1, 2, 3, 4. You've got patches that say crew 1, 2, crew 2, crew 3. So Owen Garriott was part of the patch Skylab 2 second crew versus Joe Kerwin was Skylab 2 SL2 the second launch, right. AKA the first crew, AKA patch Skylab 1. So yes, they were using different measures, both Skylab 2, but two completely separate crews.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that we kind of came across when we were, going to the Space Center in Houston, and they would all have the patches out, but it just didn't align with what, some of the actual documentation we were seeing. So we were like, wow, this is really kind of strange.
Yes. Yep. And it never got fixed. I mean, there was never to this day, 45 years later, it's still confusing people. Right.
I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit and get into some of the mission. EVAs, extra vehicular activities, were very important during the Skylab missions. We talked with Chuck a little bit more about, having to develop, handholds and umbilicals and all types of things to get them out to the telescope and back, so that they can retrieve the film and replace the film. Talk to me a little bit, that obviously changes once they have the issues with the solar array and the heat shield. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of those EVAs that took place.
So those EVAs, the spacewalks that the first crew does to save Skylab, and then later that the second crew does, changing out replacing the parasol with the solar sail to replace the heat shield. Those, to say it changed the understanding of what a spacewalk can be is understatement. It changed everything. Everything that happens in human spaceflight is built on those spacewalks that the first and second crew did on Skylab. Up until that point, there's an understanding from the early days of NASA. We're going to the moon. We get the challenge from President Kennedy. This nation should commit itself to the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and bringing him safely home. And so if you're going to do that, you've got to go outside, right? I mean, imagine a family vacation to Disney World and mom and dad and the kids get in the car and drive down to Disney World, and they pull into the parking lot, and the parents, point out the window, well, kids, there's Disney, and you drive off. That's not going to Disney World. Same thing with the moon. If you land on the moon, you look out the window at the moon, you don't go outside. That's not going to the moon. You've got to open that door. You've got to go outside. You've got to take those steps. And that means that a human being has to be able to get out of a spacecraft and walk into an environment that desperately wants to kill you and not die, right? Yep. You have to be able to go out into the cold, dark vacuum of space and survive. So after the Mercury missions that just test, can a human being go into space and come back and live through the experience? Now we're doing the Gemini program. This is the preparation for Apollo. We've got things to prove. Before we can do Apollo, Gemini has to prove three things more than anything else. Can you live in space for 2 weeks? It takes a few days to get to the moon. It takes a few days to get back. You're going to want to be there for a few days. In order to go to the moon, you have to know that you can live in space for 2 weeks. Gemini does that. Check. Accomplished. Can multiple spacecraft rendezvous and dock in space? Can you take two different vehicles, connect them up? The architecture for Apollo calls for, you've got these two vehicles, the Apollo command module, the lunar lander. They're going to go into orbit around the moon. They're going to disconnect. The lunar lander has got to go down to the surface. The Apollo command module remains in orbit around the moon. At the end of the stay on the moon, they lift off from the moon. If those two vehicles cannot connect back up, it is a very, very bad day for your moonwalkers. You've got to know that works. They do that with Gemini. They do rendezvous between two Gemini spacecraft. They do docking with a Gemini spacecraft and a docking target. Prove that this can work. Third thing is, like I said, you got to be able to go outside. You got to be able to be in a spacesuit, open that door, go outside your spaceship, live and work in that environment. And so they do this with Gemini, and what they discover is, man, this is hard. This is unpleasant. This is an incredibly challenging environment to do any work in. Now, the suit works. That functions. It protects the astronaut. It keeps the astronauts alive. That's great for what we need to go to the moon, because the problems that they're having with Gemini spacewalks is functioning in zero gravity, being outside in the void of space in zero gravity and microgravity in the spacesuit and getting things done. Well, that's fine, because what we care about on Apollo is, can you walk around on a planetary surface? You're not going to be in microgravity. You're going to be on the moon. You're going to have gravity. These problems don't matter as much because we know that we can do what we need to do. Great. Move forward. Even so, we are going to do EVAs on Apollo. We are going to do spacewalks on Apollo. They're going to go out, the astronaut, two astronauts go down to the lunar surface. One astronaut, stays in the Apollo spacecraft in orbit around the moon. We're going to have that astronaut go down to the service module of the spacecraft, perform some tasks down there. Very simple stuff. Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it easy. Let's do things that we feel comfortable, feel safe doing. Very, very simple, very straightforward. Going into to Skylab. Well, we've got these telescopes. We want these telescopes to take pictures. This is a long time ago. This is the days before iPhones, right? This is the days before you put all your pictures on iCloud and download them from the web. This is the days of film. This is the old-timey days. This is the old-fashioned stuff. You got film, which means film has to be changed. If we want to take a lot of pictures, we have to be able to change the film, and we have to be able, at the end of the mission, to go get the film, get it out of the telescope, get it out of the camera, put it in the spaceship to bring back home. So we've got to do this. We've got to be able to do these spacewalks. But again, based on the experience with Gemini, based on the experience with Apollo, let's keep it straightforward. Let's keep it simple. So they had a little path built. There was a doorway, a hatch on the airlock module of Skylab. There's handholds, there's ladders, there's easy way to get from the hatch up to the top of the telescope, designed for this task. We're going to make it as simple, as easy, as safe for the astronauts as possible. And we feel good that we can do this. A few weeks before the launch of Skylab, they have a meeting at Marshall. What do we do if something goes wrong on the outside of a different part of the space station? What do we do if something goes wrong on the outside of the workshop? Well, there's no handholds, there's no ladders, there's no easy way to get there. So the answer is nothing. There's no contingency plan. There's nothing that you can do to fix a problem if it goes wrong. But that's okay, because we feel decent that nothing's going to go wrong. This is a low risk situation. You know, there's no solution, but that's okay, because the odds of having this problem is sufficiently low that we feel it's okay to not have a contingency plan for it. Well, Skylab launches, and and according to the inescapable Murphy's Law, something goes wrong on the outside of the workshop. So the meeting is called back together. And this time, to quote the Apollo 13 movie, failure is not an option, right?
Yep.
They're, coming out of the meeting with there's nothing you can do is no longer an acceptable solution. So now we're in an entirely new era of spaceflight. Now we're in an era of spacewalks, an era of EVAs, where you're not simply doing very simple, very straightforward, very optimized tasks. Now you're improvising. Now you're having to come up with new plans in real time to react to a situation that you weren't expecting. Now you're having to do repairs of a spacecraft, which we've never had to do before. Now we're having to do complicated tasks that we haven't had to do before. Now we're having to perform tasks that maybe the spacecraft isn't designed for you to do. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
That's a very big deal. Any astronaut today that goes on a spacewalk, they're in their big white Michelin Man spacesuit. On the arm of that spacesuit, there's a patch. They've got their got their NASA patch on the front. They got their if it's a U.S. astronaut using a U.S. spacesuit, they've got their American flag there. But they have another patch designed that's worn when you're on a spacewalk. It's the only time you wear that patch is when you're on a spacewalk. The only suit it's on is on the spacewalk spacesuits. It shows a little astronaut in a spacesuit, kind of based on Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. Today, it's got 5 stars. The original version of this patch had 3 stars, and the 3 stars were put on this patch to recognize the 3 most important spacewalks in history at that point. The first star was Ed White on his Gemini flight doing the first spacewalk ever. Again, the first American spacewalk ever. It's the first American spacewalk, kind of important. Ed White gets a star for that spacewalk. Second star, a few years after that, 2 guys named Neil and Buzz go outside of their spaceship. They're not even in space; they're on a planetary surface. But even so, they somehow get a star. And the third star is Joe Kerwin and Pete Conrad doing the spacewalk to free the solar panel, to free the solar array. So that Skylab has electricity again. I mean, when that patch was made, NASA said these 3 spacewalks are the most important. We consider these 3 in a class by themselves. The first American spacewalk ever, the first footsteps on the moon, and saving Skylab. It's easy today to, the first 2 kind of get remembered pretty well. The third one is maybe not as remembered as well as Apollo 11, for example. But those 3 are in a class together. Those 3 are of importance together. And the reality is, where we are today, that third one has probably made more difference than those first 2. You look at the Hubble Space Telescope, and today, man, Hubble. I mean, that is one of NASA's great successes. Everybody loves the Hubble Space Telescope. People today tend to forget that when Hubble was launched, it was considered one of NASA's greatest failures. I mean, it was an embarrassment to NASA, to American spaceflight. They launched the telescope. It's out of focus. What do we do about it? Well, Hubble was designed for astronauts to service it, to go up there to make changes to it. We weren't planning on this.
Right.
You know, when they were planning that capability, I bet we're going to have a broken Hubble that we're going to have to do this too, was not what was on people's minds. But that what if question was, right? I mean, you know, it's that meeting at Marshall before the launch of Skylab. What is our contingency plan? Whether we think it's going to happen or not, what do we do?
Yeah.
And so astronauts were able to go up there, were able to fix Hubble. I mean, some of the later Hubble servicing missions were doing tasks that, wow, you know, I mean, again, like Skylab, working against the equipment, working against the hardware. I mean, they're doing things to it that it doesn't want done, but that have to be done. You know, all rooted in our experience with Skylab, the International Space Station, the number of spacewalks that it took to assemble the International Space Station is mind-boggling. I mean, I forget how quickly the space station had required more spacewalks than the U.S., Soviet Union, Russia had done total in history before the space station. After they launched that, I mean, it surpassed that number in a heartbeat. And it's all based on, we know we can do it. And same thing with space station. I mean, they ironically, the same thing with space station. They were moving one of the solar array panels to a new location. It got caught. The solar array couldn't deploy. It's hung on something. We've got an astronaut doing an unexpected EVA to get the solar array unhung so that they can deploy it and have the electricity they need. I mean, the same scenario that Joe and Pete's star was honoring decades later, because we had that foundation, because we had that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, one of the stories that we kind of learned about as we dug into this was that initial stand-up EVA that they did to kind of send back some images so that they could figure out, you know, exactly and confirm what they thought was wrong. And to me, coming from an industry of linemen in bucket trucks, you know, high in the air, fixing a power line, there seems to be a correlation there of, you know, hanging out of a space capsule with another astronaut holding your feet so you don't float away with a lineman tool trying to pry this solar array open. To me, that it doesn't get much more cavalier than that, but it just seemed like that was everyday work for an astronaut.
It was an unusual day. I mean, it was definitely within what a day might be, but maybe not a typical day.
Right.
And you know, the funny thing is, making a connection that I hadn't thought of before, but you watch how they do the EVAs now on the International Space Station. You've got the space station's robot arm, the Canada arm, you know, moving the astronaut into place to access the place where they're working. You know, that's kind of a lot like your ladder truck. I mean, not your ladder truck,
the bucket trucks.
The bucket. Thank you. Your bucket trucks.
Absolutely.
Moving them into place. There's kind of coming out of these layers down when you start taking it apart.
Yeah. Was there anything you learned about this story that you didn't know before?
Just hearing that perspective was exciting. Getting to see the rest of the story and getting to hear the perspective and getting to the Bosch family talking about that has been neat. Getting to see how much it meant. I mean, not even a fact that I learned necessarily, but getting to see how much of the corporate history, the corporate identity it is, how much that story has lingered on the other side has just been heartwarming. I mean, this whole experience, I am so grateful to to have gotten to be a part of this. I mean, the evening that we were all together and Chuck was pulling out, the original receipts from the tools when they were brought down from Marshall. Man, I thought I was a background.
Yeah.
but I was so glad that he's worse than I am, because those were so incredible to see. Yeah. The moment we're in the parking lot and I am holding one of those tools. I mean, this is, a story. I had done an interview. I had written about it. This was something that happened decades ago. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, something that I never, again, dreamed was a thing to dream about. I have one of those tools. Yeah. In my hands. Yeah. Man, that's thank y'all for letting me be a part of this. I mean, that's an experience that I won't soon forget. Yeah. But
it's something I didn't bring up with Chuck, and I should have, was about that tool that he had. We actually show it at some of our trade shows now, and it was a prototype tool with the cutter, the actual cable cutter. But the story of him getting that from another NASA employee that lived next door to him, that he was amazing. Like, the guy had it in his garage cutting antlers off of deer, and he just so happened mentioned it to Chuck, and Chuck was like, yeah, I would like that actually. And Chuck cleaned it up some and let us borrow it for a while. And so another amazing story that, maybe we'll get Chuck to tell us about that. What do you want people to take from the documentary? I mean, obviously it's a story of hopefully hope and how challenges can be overcome. But what's your take on what they could take away from this?
When I do talks about Skylab, and particularly I get to do talks for teachers about Skylab on a regular basis. And, I always, at the end of my talk with these teachers, okay, why do you care? Yeah. I've sat here, I've rambled about, about this thing that happened 45 years ago. You are going to go back to your schools and go back to your classrooms and have these kids, talk to these kids that, maybe their grandparents watched that happen. I mean, it's how do you make it relevant? How do you bring it home today? So as we're talking right now, this is the 50th anniversary. The documentary is going to be dropping the week of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. There's a big movie about that. 25 years ago, a lot of people have seen it. Last year was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. Right now you watch what NASA's doing, and they're talking about these next moon landings, and people talk about these things as if there's a story of that first moon landing, as if there's a story of Skylab. We titled the book, Homesteading Space, the Skylab story, as if there's a Skylab story to be told, or the story of Apollo 13, or the story of Artemis, the next moon landings. But the reality is that's an illusion. These things are all a story. Mercury and Gemini and that Apollo 11, Apollo 13 and Skylab and the space shuttle and space station and the next moon landings and ultimately sending these kids that the teachers are going back to Mars. This is a story. It's an ongoing story. It's an adventure that continues today, as much a part of those things as Neil and Buzz walking on the moon. And so, likewise, this little chapter that, the Skylab chapter that we're talking about, and the chapter of the Skylab chapter that that's in this documentary, are part of that big story. And that big story is still ongoing. And so when we talk about A.V. Chance, when we talk about, somebody waking up one morning, going into work, and accidentally saving a space station along the way, hey, honey, I'm not going to be home tonight. That's not just a historical anecdote. That's this story that, that even today there are Americans all around this country, who are doing that, that go to work at their, at their company and maybe the people working in their town have no clue what that company does to put people on the space station, what that company is doing to return us to the moon. No clue that, their next door neighbor makes, this component that's used for this part, that's used for this element, that's used for this rocket, that's launching these people to do this thing. But it's a great reminder. I mean, this story is such a great reminder that, and don't get me wrong, I'm like, NASA's pretty cool, but that it's so much bigger than a NASA thing. It's such an American story, and it's not just scientists, and it's not just rocket scientists. It's not just astronauts. It's next door neighbors around this country in small towns who are doing things that a lot of people don't realize to accomplish amazing, amazing things.
Yeah, absolutely. David, it was such a pleasure to have you involved with this. We really appreciate it. I know this won't be the last time we talk about Skylab, but wanted to thank you. And please, if you have not gotten his book, Homesteading Space, is available, I think, through Amazon. So go out there and get that. It's a great read. So thank you so much, David.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being part of this.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Power Pods. And if you haven't seen the film yet, please go to savingskylab.com and view the full documentary. Thank you.